So good evening, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Geraldine, and I'd like to introduce Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a bit like myself. She's one of the old timers. I'm sure she won't mind me telling her that. She's one of the old timers from the history group. Only Elizabeth decided to go the whole hog and actually become a history professor. There's one for you. She went back to Trinity College to study history several years ago, and she did really well. She got a first place in her initial BA, and then she went on to do a master's, and now she's studying a PhD. And her specialist subject she's always been interested in the 20th century, and also the things like the workhouses, and particularly women and the effects of what happened to women in these periods. So that's why she's going to talk about this lady, Mary, and we're going to hear all about her. So I'll let you talk away, Elizabeth. When Elizabeth is finished, we can have a Q&A.
Right, hello, listen, it's great, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak this evening. My research is about curfews and their impact on ordinary people, and the main part of this research focuses on the narratives of those people. And so my paper tonight is about Mary Rigney and her long walk home. The story is taken from the account she gave to the Bureau of Military History, her pension files, newspaper and census reports, and her family history. Mary was born in County Kildare in 1882. The 1911 census shows a 29-year-old Mary living and working as a bookkeeper in a large hotel in Bundoran in County Donegal. She was back in Dublin in 1917, and she became an active member of Cumann na mBan. She campaigned for Sinn Féin in the 1918 election and became treasurer of the Sinn Féin Club on Harcourt Street that same year. Now, you can see now, this is a Google map, and I want you to bear with me because I know it's not historically accurate, but it'll give you all an idea of her journey home that evening. And based on all the information that I have, I would say that this happened sometime between November 1920 and January 1921. And the curfew then would have started at 10 p.m. And if you were out after curfew, you could be arrested or shot if you didn't stop on the command to halt. Now, at this time, Mary lived with her family here in Clontarf, and her usual way home from the Sinn Féin Club, which was here in Harcourt Street, was to get a tram from Kelly's Corner, just here. And that would take her as far as the Pillar, which used to be in O'Connell Street here. And then she'd get a second tram home to Clontarf. Well, that evening, Mary became so engrossed in the meeting that she was at the Harcourt Street Sinn Féin Club, she had to rush to Kelly's Corner and she missed the last tram. And then, as she says in her own words, she had to take all kinds of shortcuts to get to the Pillar. And when she got to the Pillar, she saw the last tram disappearing around North Earl Street. Mary recalls, "I was unfortunate in having a new pair of shoes on, and I looked to see if I could get any conveyance to take me home, as I knew I could never walk that distance." She hailed a Jarvie, but the driver would only take her as far as here in Fairview. And then she had to walk the rest of the way home. He just wouldn't go any further. He flatly refused because he was afraid of being out after curfew himself. So she got out of the car and started to walk. Then she tried to run, but couldn't because of her shoes. They were too tight. She knew that British troops were stationed here at Dollymount, and she still had about 2.5 kilometers to walk before she could get home. And that would have taken her about 25 to 30 minutes. So time was running out. To add to Mary's woes, she was carrying a roll book which contained the names and addresses of all the Sinn Féin Club members, and this explains her increasing anxiety to get to safety. She said, "This was more important to me than any tight shoes or sore feet, as the book would give valuable information to the enemy if I was arrested and the book was captured." So, at Holt Road Corner, Mary took off her shoes and decided to run the rest of the way home in her stocking feet. She goes on, and this is Mary's own words, "I was very uncertain how to protect the club book, if I saw any of the military coming, and so I finally decided, if I did see them coming, to walk up the path to the hall door of one of the houses as if it was my own until the military passed. My next thought was that I was very near Clontarf police station, and there was always some of them hanging around the barracks. They would know me by sight, and it might interest them to find out why I was going home in my stocking feet, carrying my shoes in my hands. So I decided to put them back on again and walk past the barrack as best I could. The police were all right. They didn't stop me. They merely said good night, and I walked on until I was out of sight. I had just decided to stop at a shop door and take off my shoes again when I saw approaching me 4 DMP carrying rifles. I walked on coolly, and the sergeant said good night, and I said, would you mind telling me the time, please? I'm afraid it must be near curfew time. I missed my tram coming home from a party, and I hope the military are not about. The sergeant said, don't worry, they have not come out yet, and if you do meet them, they will probably bring you back to us, and you'll be all right. They passed on, and I took off my shoes again and ran for dear life until I got to my own gate with no soles to me stockings. I just got inside when a military lorry flew past en route from Dollymount to Dublin. Sorry, Mary's walked off. Now, Mary's perilous journey home that evening illustrates the dangers of the curfew for those involved in the War of Independence. The curfew restricted IRA activities, and activists like Mary, caught abroad with important information, were at risk. Mary was 40 when this happened, and she was living with her invalid brother, her aged aunt, and her 4 sisters. In January 1921, soldiers raided her home in Clontarf, and she was arrested for possession of 2 revolvers and 21 rounds of ammunition. She refused to get in the lorry with the soldiers and demanded they contact Dublin Castle to send a car. When the officer in charge insisted she get in the lorry, she refused again, telling him, you have no women searchers with you and you can't lay a hand on me. Despite being bullied and harassed by the officer, she insisted on waiting for the car, which eventually came for her, and she was taken away. At her court-martial, Mary declined to recognise the court and was later sentenced to 9 months in prison. She gave this witness statement in 1952. In the intervening years, she gave up on politics during the Civil War, saying she had too many friends on both sides of the split. She went to live in America in 1926, where she worked for 7 years until 1932, when she returned to Ireland. She was then employed by the Hospitals Trust until 1940. Her letters to the Ministry of Defence in the pension files see her seeking a special allowance because she was having difficulties making ends meet. She could no longer work and was dependent on a small military pension of £8, 6 shillings and 8 pence per annum, and an allowance of £60 a year from her sister, who was still living in New York. She appears to have had no other relatives living near her at this time, and her poor health prevented her from continuing to work. She was eventually granted a special allowance in 1956. Her file contains many letters from Mary, pleading her case, but always with respect to those she was dealing with, and gratitude for what she was receiving already, small though it was. She died in 1968 in St. Kevin's Hospital, aged 92. Her story is important not only because of her heroics on the way home that evening and during the curfew and on the day of her arrest, but because, and this is important, it demonstrates the vulnerability of women. Narratives are emerging about gendered and sexual violence during the revolutionary period. The historian Susan Byrne, in a recent article, writes that sexual violence did not feature as a weapon of war during this period, but she argues there was targeted and widespread gendered violence. The evidence is there, but needs to be interrogated closely, and with due regard to the natural reticence of Irish women to talk about or report such matters. In November 1920, the problem of women being searched by men was raised in the British Parliament. The Chief Secretary of Ireland was asked if he was aware that the auxiliary police in Ireland had started to search women and girls in the streets in certain parts of the country. He stated he was not aware of women and girls in the street being searched. He stated he was not aware of cases of women and girls being searched except by women searchers. Searching of women except by women is unauthorized. where it is necessary to search women, no man is allowed to be present at the search. Well, the men arresting Mary that evening did not get this memo. All this indicates a growing sense of unease with the behaviour of the auxiliary forces in Ireland. This question was asked just days after the shooting of 14 alleged British intelligence officer agents on Bloody Sunday on the 21st of November, and the reprise was later that day when the Blackened Hands opened fire on spectators watching a Gaelic football match at Croke Park in Dublin. There was a huge furore about these incidents on both sides of the Irish Sea, and it is significant that a gender issue was raised at such a tumultuous time. This was probably more to do with a sense that this was ungentlemanly behaviour on the part of British Crown representatives than any partiality for feminism or women's rights. It is, however, evident that gendered violence was a real problem in Ireland and that there was an awareness of it at the highest levels. At that time, at that same common session, the Irish Nationalist MP Jeremiah McVeigh asked the Chief Secretary for Ireland, Sir Hamer Greenwood, whether he had yet received any official reports confirming that 3 men in plain clothes, describing themselves as Blackened Hands, demanded admission to 157 North Circular Road in Dublin after midnight. The house was occupied by 2 ladies and a housekeeper, and on entering the house, shots were fired. When they were arrested later, it was found they were drunk and had left the barracks in mufti after curfew when the streets were empty. The Chief Secretary replied that he was aware of the incident, but would not comment until an inquiry had been carried out. This terrible episode confirms that women were at risk, even in their own homes after curfew, and importantly, it supports the contention that there was targeted and widespread violence. It also speaks to a growing atmosphere of danger, particularly for women, as the nights grew darker, the curfew continued, and the violence escalated. It's conceivable that Mary's age and resourcefulness saved her from some form of gendered violence. By the time she had to negotiate that long journey home, the raid on her home and her subsequent arrest, Mary was mature enough to be able to assert her right not to be searched and manhandled. She was calm and level-headed and engaged with the police on her journey home, and consequently ensured her own safety and that of the documents she carried. By that time, she had lived away from home, held a responsible position at work, and had been involved in nationalist politics since 1917. However, her case does invite an obvious question. Had she been younger and less experienced, would the outcome have been different? Would it have been more dangerous? That walk home from Harcourt Street was 6.5 kilometres, filled with anxiety and danger. In her witness statement, her concerns about her new shoes and touring stockings masked the real fear she had of being captured. Her reference to the barracks in Dollymount and the police at Clontarf show how aware she was of the seriousness of the situation. Apart from the new uncomfortable shoes, she was prepared and ready for all eventualities. Other women, perhaps younger and less experienced in a similar predicament, may not have fared so well. Despite all this, the experience clearly unnerved her. The fear of being abroad after curfew and the subsequent onslaught of a raiding party was terrifying. The suffragist Mary Connery wrote, "Women know that it is during curfew hours attempts of a sexual character have been made. It is difficult to appreciate the effects which this continued strain is producing upon the health of women." And the historian Louise Ryan writes that during the Anglo-Irish War, the distinctions between the battlefield and the home front became blurred, and women were increasingly drawn into situations of conflict. I would argue that curfews blurred these distinctions even further. It impacted everybody, irrespective of class and gender, and it brought chaos and disruption into everyday life. The other interesting thing to note from Mary's testimony is the way the policemen she met clearly saw the curfew patrols as something apart from them. "Don't worry," the sergeant had told her. They have not come out yet, and if you do meet them, they will probably bring you back to us and you'll be all right. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that statement. The Dublin Metropolitan Police were responsible for policing the capital. However, all that changed during the War of Independence, when the force was supplemented by British recruits dubbed the Blackened Hands, and subsequently a group of ex-army officers were attached as auxiliaries to the RIC. These Oxys and Blackened Hands became hated figures in Ireland and attracted criticism from all quarters. They became, rightly or wrongly, firmly associated with the activities of the RIC and DMP, and as recent controversy will tell us, feelings ran deep and still do. But in this instance, Mary seems to have more confidence in that ordinary policeman than those stationed at Dollymount Barracks. The sergeant also distinguishes between his force and them. He tells her she will be all right because they will return her to the DMP. Significantly, this section of Mary's witness statement speaks to the nuances and vagaries of life in the revolutionary period. It shows how people like the sergeant and Mary had to navigate their days and nights. They both acknowledged that the Blackened Hands or auxiliaries were different, more dangerous, and the sergeant was even offering some form of protection. Mary, in her role as a Republican activist, would have viewed the DMP as part of the enemy, a representative of the empire, and all that entailed. But on this occasion, she was happy to have met them and not their supposed colleagues in the auxiliary force. And that's it. I'll end there. Thank you. Load up for discussion now. I'll just stop sharing my screen. There we go. Oh,
that was great, Elizabeth. Thanks a lot for that. We put a lot of work into it. I was just wondering, what was Mary's side in the Civil War, or did she ever say?
Oh, she would have been anti-treaty.
Anti-treaty, yeah. She didn't take part, though. She didn't take an active part, you were saying?
She said she didn't take an active part because she had too many friends on both sides. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, I have now enabled everybody to unmute themselves. If you'd like to ask questions, you could either ask it out loud or put it in the chat, whatever you like. Yeah.
I'm surprised actually that she as you said, she took advantage of the fact that the DMP were there, although she probably wouldn't have liked them under normal circumstances, but she realized that her back was against the wall, I guess.
I suppose the more I study history, the more I see there's no such thing as black and white. There's gray areas all the time. It's just, you can't comment on what you would do or what you wouldn't do in any situation. I mean, you just do the best you can. You just do what we all do in everyday life. I suppose that's why I like studying history the way I do. I have over the years of going to university, I learned all different ways of studying history, political history, economic history, global history, all kinds of history. But the one that appeals to me most is what I would call bottom-up history. So I always look at how did ordinary people, what was everyday life like at a particular time and event, and by doing that, you pull out then what's going on, what's happening, what's happening in the wider world, but how it's affecting the person on the street, the ordinary person, and that's what appeals to me, and that's how I approach most of my work now.
That's great. Thanks a lot.
I should imagine, though, that the members of the DMP were recruited from a different segment of society. Would I be right in thinking that? Possibly a more homely kind of a recruit than the kind of person who'd end up in the army or the RIC?
I couldn't say, Beverly. I wouldn't be able to, I couldn't say. Yeah, I think most DMP were just ordinary men in this job, like being a policeman,
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, so it seemed to me it would be more the possibility of it being a more local person or somebody who was more like Mary.
I suppose the point I was trying to make was, that Mary, would have regarded DMP as the enemy. because the DMP and the RIC would have been regarded as well. They were employed as
But they were
representatives.
qualitatively different, I would have thought.
But I suppose what I was trying to bring out there was the nuances of the situation. Although she would have regarded them as the enemy, she was actually very happy to throw her lot in with them that night because she was in dire straits. She had this roll book with names and addresses of because there's a lot more I could tell you about Mary. I mean, she was very closely involved with Arthur Griffiths and Michael Collins. When I say she was closely involved, she had to make their lunch every day, and she really objected to that. And she was kind of a proto-feminist, I think, Mary, although she was quite practical. I feel like I know her now because I've spent so long with her. I think she took a quite practical view, but look, I have to make their lunch, so I'll just get on with it. But she grumbled about it. She wasn't happy, and she thought she much better fit to be doing other things, but she got on with it, and yeah. And the night that she was engrossed in the meeting, and why she missed her last tram home, is that they were discussing somebody had stolen a watch, and she was get into this story about the watch being stolen, and she wanted to know. She had her suspicions who stole the watch, but she missed the end of it. Yeah. Anyway, and at the end of it all, she says, in one point in her witness statement, she says, "Oh, and by the way, they found that watch. It wasn't stolen in the end." So it's obviously very, and also it just appealed to me, from a woman's point of view, the concern about the stockings and the shoes, and I just thought, that's just typical. The one night you'd want to run, you'd have tight shoes on you, and the whole story, and I just thought. When I read this, right, okay, so the kind of history I study, it's about ordinary people, and what you have to understand is most ordinary people don't get written about or don't write about themselves, and sometimes would probably never keep a diary. So you have to find their stories in different ways. So can you imagine how wonderful it was me just to find that story in those files? It was manna from heaven for me. It was fantastic find. Here was a woman, an ordinary woman, chatting about the subject that I'm really interested in. So it was absolutely fabulous to just find somebody saying, "Well, look at here, I was going home and I had to run because my shoes were too tight, and I had to, go up, try and hide." And the bit about her going up the footpath to pretend she was going in somebody else's front door. I mean, it's just typical.
Obviously could think on her feet. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but it's just all the things that, if you were in that situation, you'd think, "Oh, what can I do now? Can I run up here? Whatever." And it just came across, and I just think it just captured for me, what it must have been like at that time if it was getting to 10 o'clock and time was ticking, and you were out because I mean, I'm not making light of this, and my research has uncovered the most awful stories of people being caught out, children, women. One woman in Cork, she just stuck her head literally out the window to see what was going on, and she after curfew, and she was shot in the head, and her 5-week-old baby was behind her in the cot. So I mean, it was a desperate time for ordinary people, and I mean, you may say in a war, not everybody is directly involved in a war. If you're not a combatant, if you're not planting a bomb, if you're not doing all that thing, then you're not involved. But curfews, and this is what fascinates me about them, no more than the lockdowns affected all of us in last year and the year before. Curfews affected everybody. It didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter what status you had, you had to be indoors at whatever time they said. So it just was across the board, and I just think it's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as a measure, it's designed for the civilian population, isn't it? They would be the only people to whom it would be relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
But
what did ordinary people do in the event of an emergency? Like somebody got sick in the middle of the night, could they do anything about it? Like there was no telephones.
Not really. And there's like, I mean, this is all part of a huge, bit of research, but I mean, at the moment, I'm only in my first year and I'm just slowly going through all the newspapers forensically just to get stories and to actually plot, because the other thing about the curfews during the War of Independence was they were at different times. So you could be at 6 o'clock in Cork and 7 o'clock in Limerick, and
No.
so I'm just plotting where they occurred and how long. Sorry, what was the question again? Sorry,
Yeah, like what did you do in the event of an emergency?
Yeah, I'm reading stories about the midwives, for example, and the master of the Rotunda saying he wasn't allowing his midwives to go out and to deliver babies. Doctors, there's nearly every day I'm seeing stories about doctors saying, look, I'm in fear of my life. So basically what happened was people just had to get on with it, and do the best they could. They because you could get permits, but the point is, it was dark, and the other thing is, by the time somebody had stopped you, the other thing the doctor said, it just got on their nerves being constantly stopped and having to show their permits as they were going around the city. So just going around, just negotiating, going around. But the other thing is that Dublin Corporation and a lot of other city corporations, in protest, wouldn't turn the lights on in the streets. So the lights weren't on. So it was even darker at night because they were saying they were sending their men out to light the lamps in the street because it was after curfew. It was just absolute chaos. Yeah.
And was it countrywide or was it only in the towns and cities?
That's a really interesting question, and I can't give you a full answer yet. I think most counties so far now. I Belfast, Cork, Dublin, but I've had it in places like Baltinglass, Eden Derry, places you'd be thinking, well, what's curfew doing there? Do you know what I mean? Sligo, and then it's interesting because I've just started to look at the Civil War now, and then there's different places in the Civil War. And the other interesting thing that would be for me is to see how the curfew operated by the British, and was it any different under an Irish administration. I'm also looking at the 1970 curfew in the Falls Road, and again I'm lucky enough to actually have somebody who I can interview and do an oral history, and that'll be fantastic because I'll obviously get that's a brilliant way to get information as well. So one of the things I'd like to do at the end of this is to actually maybe do a comparison to see, were curfews different in this era? Were they different? Were people affected? Did things change? So yeah. So I can't really give you a really full answer to that, Chair, but 4 years time, yeah. When you
Right.
yeah.
I'll hold you to that.
Was it used, Elizabeth, the curfews were probably used by to look out for insurgents and things like that, because people couldn't leave their houses. So it was a great opportunity for the Blackened Hands or whatever to go into houses and get insurgents. Or
Yeah, I mean, curfews have been used since the Middle Ages. I mean, they're one of the oldest measures Kiev, the first thing the Lord Mayor did in Kiev was introduce a curfew. I mean, they are used all the time, so they're nothing new. But my research is kind of showing up. They don't work. They work up to a point, but what they actually do is get everybody's backs up, and you get things like people who wouldn't normally be political or be against a ruling, like, for example, my main research at the moment is around the War of Independence. You get a lot of people who probably would be just, oh, look at here, I can't be bothered, I couldn't care less. They'd be just going around their ordinary life, but it would get on their nerves, the fact that they would be continually having to run home, curfew times changing, missing shifts at work, all of that kind of stuff going on. So it would actually get people's backs up, and it would actually maybe push them into maybe supporting the IRA or that kind of activities going on. So, I mean, the great example of that, of course, is the Falls Road one in 1970. I mean, most commentators will say that that was the turning point for when the British Army came in. Up to then, they were getting cups of tea, when the nationalist community, Catholic community, were welcoming them because they saw them as protectors against the loyalists. The Falls Road curfew, which lasted 3 days and was actually a full curfew where people couldn't leave their houses at all, turned that community overnight, over 3 days, just turned them, and the provost used it as a recruiting ground afterwards. So, you know, I know it's something that's used an awful lot, but I'm not sure it works. Now, I can't say that for definite, but my research so far would say that it doesn't work.
Nice, very good.
In the course of looking for a picture to illustrate your talk, I know this is a bit off topic, but I came upon Mary Rigney in her nursing career in America, where it seemed like it was an article about Irish nurses who had had a very major impact on the organization of the American hospital system. Do you know anything about that?
Same Mary Rigney, what do you think?
Sorry?
Same Mary Rigney, what do you think?
I guess I couldn't swear to it. The dates looked about right from what you were saying. What do you know about her time in America?
She went to America in 1926, and she worked there till 1932. It didn't say she was a nurse, and I've never picked up anything about her being a nurse.
Oh, okay. So maybe that was that's where I went astray. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it could be. I mean, I have searched high up and low down for picture of Mary, because I would love. First thing Geraldine asked me when I was going to this talk, she said, "We've not got a picture of the poor woman." And I said, "No, I haven't." And I mean, doesn't that speak to? I mean, I don't know about you, but I think she's wonderful, and I think we should have pictures of her. You know, I think she's the way she stood up to the officer in her house that day, and you know, the way she used to stand up to Griffiths and Collins, and you know, I just think she's a wonderful person. But doesn't it speak to how women in history are treated in general, that we don't have a picture of her? And you know, we've got lots of pictures of other people, but people like her. And I mean, at her court martial, I mean, she claims in her pension files, and again, I can't verify this, that she was the first woman to be court-martialed. So I don't know how true that is, but
we have a question from Sonia in the chat who would like to know, what did she work at? Did she have a job?
Yeah. She was a bookkeeper in Donegal in 1911, and the 1911 census shows that she was a bookkeeper in it seemed a very large hotel. Do you remember I showed you the census? So she was part of that big household, and then she came back and she joined Cumann na mBan. She was very active in Cumann na mBan, and she would be out, you know, marching and doing the practicing that they used to do. And then she worked in this Harcourt Street in the Sinn Féin club for Griffiths. She was a housekeeper for them, really. You know, she looked after them, and you know, she would take minutes of meetings and all the stuff. I hate to say it, all the stuff that women did at that stage, you know, they for the men. So you know, she would have been doing that. Yeah, but you can see from her journey home that night, and the way she stood up to the soldiers, and she hid. I mean, again, I didn't put it in the talk, but you know, when she knew they were coming to raid the house, I don't know how she knew, but she did, and she had the aged aunt in the room, and the aged aunt had a commode, so she put some of the papers in the commode because she thought the soldiers aren't going to look in there. I just think she's fabulous. You know?
She was a quick thinker, that's for sure.
Yeah. And you know, she just yeah, she was just wonderful. And you know, I just had this vision of her, you know, going home with the shoes and all the rest of it. So yeah.
And what did she do in America? Do you know? Was she just on low wages, or you know, low skilled jobs?
just said she was working there. It doesn't say.
Yeah.
When she came back to Ireland, she was employed by the Hospitals Trust until 19.
All right.
Yeah, and then she was in poor health, and I mean she's got 3 big thick pension files, and it would make you cry reading her letters, seriously. And I mean, you know, she's one of many, but I suppose because I really liked her, I was just very sad for her, because I just thought, isn't it awful that somebody like her has to be appealing to these,
Yeah.
I won't swear because I'm being recorded, but appealing to these fellas in the ministry, you know, in the Ministry of Defence, you know, for a few bob just to get by. And she was one of hundreds, you know, that was doing. People weren't treated very well, particularly women. And you know,
Sometimes you need a man.
Yeah. So anyway, she finally did get granted something in 1956, and then she died in St. Kevin's Hospital. I think she was in St. Kevin's Hospital at that stage because the solicitor who's acting on her behalf, is, you can see that he's you know, it's changed. You know, the address where they're writing to is changed to St. Kevin's Hospital. So yeah.
That would have been in poor circumstances, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were very
Sorry,
badly treated, Elizabeth, really, weren't they? Because they struggled for years to get their pensions, where the men got them as a matter of course, but the women, they really struggled.
Not necessarily. I mean, a lot of men didn't get it either. I mean, it depended on whose side you were on in the Civil War, and you know, people did struggle. It wasn't easy for people at that time, as we all know. When the stage was just beginning, there was a terrible poverty in this country, and there wasn't anyone to deal with it. So you know, it was hard to get pensions. That's why those pension files, I mean, if anybody's interested in actually, you know, reading, I mean, they're fantastic to go through and read, and a lot of them are digitized now. I mean, they are quite difficult to navigate, I think, sometimes, those pension files, but it is worth the perseverance. I mean, you will read some really good stuff in there.
Yeah, we have a very interesting question. Sorry, Marie, I'll go back to you in a second. Yep. We have a very interesting question from Carol. What were the charges for her to become to get court-martialed, and how was she considered military? Yeah,
she was a member of Common Mom, and she had, what was it, 20? She was caught in possession of 21 rounds of ammunition and 2 revolvers.
Okay, but wasn't she technically a civilian, or she wasn't? How did that work?
Would have been considered. She was court-martialed, and the newspapers used the term court-martial as well, and she used the term court-martial. So, you know, I can only tell you what I see, and that says that she was court-martialed. Yeah.
Well, the country was at war, and she was under arms technically because she was carrying arms. So that's why she would have been court-martialed, regardless of gender or anything else. Yeah.
Thanks, Aisling. Yeah.
So may I ask, please, where is St. Kevin's Hospital?
Oh, you've got me.
It's gone now. I think, was it part of the workhouse?
In Cork Street?
Yeah, because I had a couple of relations, great-greats or great-uncles or whatever, and in St. Kevin's, and that's where you went when you had no money, basically. It was the precursor to a hospital.
And so you don't know where she's buried?
No, I don't know where she's buried, and I don't know where she's buried. Yeah, I would like to find out, because I would actually like to go and put something on her grave. Yeah.
I think St. Kevin's was Brú Cíbhín, it was called. Was it in Cork Street? Is that the same place?
I don't know,
Geraldine. Yeah. I know there was a Brú Cíbhín, I think it is, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't. But I mean, you know what? I'm going to go and try and find out now. You've asked me.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We'll keep you up all night.
I did this talk a couple of weeks ago for a group, and nobody asked me that, and I think that's a really good question. I don't know where it came. I look at, you know, she was living in Bray at that time, So I often wondered if it was somewhere out that way, you know. I don't know.
She might be buried out in Mount Jerome, or not, Dean's Grange, maybe. Class if you get in touch with Class Nevin, even if she's not there, they'll at least tell you she's not there. They have amazing records of burials.
They do, yeah.
Yeah, they're fabulous.
Yeah, I'll do that.
We'll keep you up all night, Elizabeth.
I would. I know this sounds corny. I'd actually love to go and visit her grave, you know. And during COVID, I mean, one of my 5K was walking out near Clontarf police station and all the rest of it. And I used to just walk out. I used to literally look around me thinking, oh, this is where she was, you know. I felt really close to her. I think when you go in deep with these people, you develop a, you know, you think you know them.
Absolutely, yeah.
And she never married, Elizabeth, no?
No, she never. No, she was 40. She was 40 when she was arrested, you know, and all that happened. Yeah, she wasn't a young one, you know. No, I don't really like, you know what I mean? She wasn't.
Yeah.
For the times, yeah.
She was. By the
Sorry,
time
the cat keeps knocking me thing over.
By the time she came back to Dublin after being in Donegal working, I mean, she was in her 30s, so she was late to the game in a way. I've always imagined coming along women were younger, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I haven't got any proof of that, but it's just yeah.
Good for her.
Yeah. She was some woman, all right.
Some woman, yeah.
I was just laughing though. I had to, not laughing, but when you were talking about like her going home and the panic and taking off the shoes and all the rest, it reminded me of so many times when I was younger, and like, you know, when you were allowed out first and you had to be home by a certain time and you weren't. Sometimes I've missed buses and walked home and I should, and the sweat. And so when you were describing that journey, in my head, I was doing a journey home from a pal's house or wherever when I'd missed the bus and there was no taxi fares back then. And it was still the same. It brought it back, you know, and how she must have felt like she must have been really scared, you know.
Yeah, it was, you know, I can't. Somebody said to me, you make it a bit light-hearted. I'm not. It's not light at all. You know, it was a terrible time. I mean, you know, it was. Yeah, it was scary.
Yeah.
Those curfew patrols were scary. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because if you think of how nervous we all were, I mean, I don't know about you, but during lockdown, you know, when initially it happened, we were all really wary of seeing the guards. Do you remember when they used to stop you to see car? I mean, even if you've done nothing, you'd be a bit wary. Well, can you imagine, you know, they had a gun and going to shoot you if you were out, you know, it ramps up the anxieties. I'm very interested in how that would have affected people, with the whole kind of anxiousness that went on, you know, which must have been pervasive for everybody.
Absolutely, yeah. Like most of us feel the guards are on our side, but in those days, obviously they weren't, you know, or the police, rather the DMP and the military and whatever. So you were afraid of them. They had all the power and you had nothing, you know.
And the resentment that it must have built up. That's what ties in with what you were saying, Elizabeth, that how curfews don't work, because people would just, as it goes on, it becomes less and less about you being protected, which is how they were selling it to people in the first place. This is for your own safety. And as time goes on, people are going, it's not, it's just curtailing our movements and our freedom to go here and go there, you know?
I mean, in that summer of 1921, it was really hot summer, and the curfew went to 9 o'clock here in Dublin, and in Cork it was at 6 o'clock. And I mean, can you imagine being in the tenements or in those crowded places and trying to keep children in at that time?
Yeah.
You know, it must have been horrendous. I mean, we all again look back to lockdown, and you know, we were feeling sorry for all the mums who were trying to entertain kids in the houses and all the rest of it. Can you imagine what that was like? and they were all bashed into maybe one room, 10 people. It was awful, and they couldn't go out, and the social life of people. I mean, there's newspaper accounts of men. I mean, I know men giving out because they couldn't go to the pub for their pint on the way home. That all of that stuff had stopped, and the women giving out because they couldn't go for their pint, and they were annoying them in the house. So I mean, a whole kind of social kind of mores that people were used to all got upended, and again, parallels with today. I remember coming up to Christmas this year and last year when all the traders were giving out stink about, can we lift the lockdown? We want people back in. Same thing in the papers coming in 1920 and 21, coming up to Christmas.
Really?
All the traders going bananas because the shoppers couldn't get in to do their Christmas shopping and that kind of thing. So, it's nothing changes. Everything's the same. Yes. So
I'll just mention a quick aside. Rushing has provided us with the information that St. Kevin's is now St. James's Rialto.
Yeah.
Really, thank you. Thanks, Roisin.
Yeah, it would have been part of the workhouse. It was the hospital, St. Kevin. It'd be interesting as well what you were saying, Elizabeth, about families being stuck at home together. And I know they're doing studies on our lockdowns and domestic violence and the increases in domestic violence. And it just got me thinking, just what you said there. I'm sure it was the very same. People stuck in a very hot summer in a very small room, that it must have been really, really difficult for women in that regard, as well as in, other ways that you'd already talked about,
One of the things that I can only speculate about, because it's very hard to get figures on domestic violence even now, because women don't report it, and they certainly didn't report it in the 1920s, because men were allowed to hit their wives in the 1920s. It wasn't seen as any great, if a woman was checked, as they would say, and given the clout. So domestic violence probably would have gone unrecorded, although not wholly. So it's something I am interested in, but I don't think I can come to any firm conclusions about it because I don't have the evidence. But I can maybe try and come at that evidence from another way. I don't know. But yes, I would speculate that domestic violence did rise because it has risen during lockdown.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think Mary McGuire's got her hand up.
No.
Oh,
No.
sorry.
I find it very interesting. Very
Hi.
interesting talk.
Yeah, sorry. So, any more questions?
Anyone else? So I'll stop the recording now, and if anybody kind of has